Let's kick off by clarifying what we mean by the Zone of Potential Agreement, or ZOPA. Dr. Harris, can you explain the core concept and why it's foundational in negotiation theory?
Absolutely. The ZOPA is essentially the range in which two parties can find common ground where the buyer's maximum willingness to pay overlaps with the seller's minimum acceptable offer. Without this overlap, negotiation is futile, as no agreement can satisfy both sides.
So, if there's no ZOPA, parties are just wasting time negotiating, right?
Precisely. Attempting to negotiate without a potential agreement zone is like trying to buy a house with a budget far below the seller's lowest price. Unless expectations or circumstances shift, an agreement simply can't materialize.
Moving forward, there's a common misconception that negotiation is always worth pursuing. Can you expand on why negotiation isn't free and what hidden costs are involved?
Great point. Negotiating requires time, emotional energy, and sometimes even money. Think of legal fees or travel expenses for face-to-face meetings. Teams may also divert focus from other tasks. A Harvard study found that unproductive negotiations can cost organizations up to 15% of deal value.
That's significant. So parties should weigh these costs against the potential gains before committing resources to the process.
Exactly. The decision to negotiate should hinge on whether the likely outcome justifies the investment, especially if alternatives may be less costly or more efficient.
This brings us to the idea of knowing when not to negotiate. How do alternatives shape the decision to engage in talks at all?
Negotiators must always consider their BATNAth best alternative to a negotiated agreement. If your BATNA surpasses what's possible in the current negotiation, it's wiser to walk away. For example, if you can get a better price elsewhere, investing time here isn't rational.
So, assessing your BATNA is essentially a risk management step before entering negotiations.
Correct. It also strengthens your position since you're not desperate. Knowing your walkaway point ensures you don't settle for less than you could achieve independently.
Let's delve into target setting. How do negotiators determine their desired outcomes, and what's the impact of setting ambitious versus realistic targets?
Targets anchor expectations. If you set an unrealistically high goal, you risk deadlock, too low, and you leave value on the table. Research from Stanford suggests that negotiators who set aggressive but justifiable targets secure better outcomes 80% of the time.
That's compelling. So, should negotiators always aim high, or are there drawbacks?
It's a balancing act. Aggressive targets can spark creative solutions, but if they're perceived as unreasonable, the other party may disengage. Calibration based on market data and past deals is key.
Next, let's examine how buyers and sellers approach negotiations differently. Can you illustrate how their perspectives shape the ZOPA?
Buyers typically focus on minimizing cost, often anchoring negotiations with a low initial offer. Sellers, conversely, prioritize maximizing revenue. For example, in procurement, buyers may leverage competitive bidding, while sellers highlight added value to justify higher prices.
That dynamic fuels the bargaining process. But how do perceptions versus realities affect the possible agreement zone?
Misjudging the other side's limits can shrink or even eliminate the ZOPA. Transparency and information gathering are crucial for accurate assessment and avoiding missed opportunities.
Let's get specific. How do parties calculate the ZOPA in practical terms? Can you walk us through a scenario with concrete numbers?
Certainly. Imagine a buyer's ceiling is 1,500 and a seller's floor is 1,200. The ZOPA is the 300 range between those points. If the seller's lowest price was 2,0 and the buyer's max was 1,500, there's no ZOPA, so negotiation is pointless unless circumstances change.
So, ZOPA is essentially the overlap between each party's acceptable range, and knowing this prevents wasted effort.
Right. This also allows negotiators to focus discussions within an achievable spectrum, avoiding posturing outside realistic bounds.
Let's clarify the difference between a party's preference and their reservation point. How do these concepts play out in real negotiations?
A preference is the ideal outcome, like a buyer hoping to pay 1,0, while the reservation point is the maximum or minimum they'll accept, say 1,500. The seller's preference might be 2,0, but their reservation point is 1,200. Agreements typically land closer to these reservation boundaries.
So, the dance of negotiation is moving from preferences toward those critical thresholds.
Exactly. Skilled negotiators use concessions and creative structuring to edge outcomes toward their preferred values, but rarely achieve them outright.
You mentioned distributive negotiation earlier. How does this compare to integrative or win-win negotiation, especially regarding ZOPA?
Distributive bargaining is zero-sum each dollar gained by one party is a dollar lost by the other, so ZOPA is a fixed pie. Integrative negotiation, however, seeks to expand value, like adding service terms or creative financing, broadening ZOPA and potentially benefiting both sides.
Is one approach more prevalent in business contexts?
Most negotiations have elements of both. Price may be distributive, but negotiating delivery timelines or warranties introduces integrative possibilities, making it a hybrid process.
Now, let's explore strategies to expand the ZOPA. What techniques can negotiators use to create more mutually acceptable outcomes?
One effective method is to introduce additional issues, payment terms, after-sales service, or volume discounts. A 2022 MIT study showed that deals involving multiple variables were 40% more likely to close, as parties could trade off priorities and enlarge the agreement zone.
So, flexibility on secondary terms can compensate for rigidities on price or other primary issues.
Exactly. This transforms the negotiation from a tug-of-war into a problem-solving exercise, often resulting in higher satisfaction for both parties.
Finally, how can parties recognize when negotiation is simply futile, and what are the best next steps in such cases?
When there's no ZOPAs, the buyer's max is 1, 500 and the seller's min is 2. Zero continuing talks wastes time and resources. The best course is to disengage respectfully and pursue alternatives, possibly revisiting talks if circumstances shift.
That's a great point. Recognizing these signals early prevents sunk costs and preserves relationships for future opportunities.
Absolutely. It's about strategic resource allocation and maintaining professionalism, even when a deal isn't feasible at the moment.